So where is text complexity in the Common Core state standards? In the standards, we know that we should have regular practice with complex text and its academic language. Rather than focusing solely on the skills of reading and writing, the standards highlight the growing complexity of text students must read to be ready for the demands of college and careers. The standards build a staircase of complexity so that all students are ready for the demands of college and career reading no later than the end of high school. Closely related to text complexity and connected to reading comprehension is the focus on academic vocabulary, words that appear in a variety of content areas, such as ignite and commit. Here's a graphic of the literacy standards: writing, reading, speaking, listening. And under reading, we see that text complexity and the growth of comprehension. Also, remember that literacy applies to all content areas, thus the need for a school-wide literacy plan. So why does text complexity matter? In 2006, the ACT released a report called The Reading Between the Lines that showed which skills differentiated those students who equaled or exceeded the benchmark score of 21 out of 36 in the reading section of the ACT college admissions test from those who did not. Surprisingly, what chiefly distinguished the performance of those students who had earned the benchmark score, or better, from those who had not, was their relative ability in making inferences while reading or answering questions related to a particular cognitive process, such as determining main ideas or determining the meaning of words and phrases in text. Instead, the clearest differentiator was the student's ability to answer questions associated with complex texts. This finding is the impetus behind the standards, the strong emphasis on increasing text complexity as a key requirement in reading. Being able to read complex texts independently and proficiently is essential for high achievement in college and the workplace, and important in numerous life tasks. Moreover, current trends suggest that if students cannot read challenging texts with understanding, if they have not developed the skill, concentration, and stamina to read such texts, they will read less in general. Here is the three-part model for measuring text complexity. 1. Qualitative dimensions of text complexity. 2. Quantitative dimensions of text complexity. And 3. The reader and task considerations. The standards presume that all three elements will come into play when text complexity and appropriateness are determined. So now to destruct text. It is not just about giving students harder text, it's about consistency getting out of their comfort zones. We need to learn what compromises text complexity and how to incorporate it purposefully into the classroom. We need to think about text complexity and the nuances of text complexity. Giving students text complexity means giving them a variety of text to create opportunities to transfer their learning. This includes teaching students the skills of questioning, making inferences, paraphrasing, tracing an argument or thought. One way to start thinking about matching text and reader is to begin with what you already have. You can take a text you frequently teach. Now with that text, consider how you would make the text more complex by simply changing the task. In other words, change the task, not the text. This is where the application of this course into your classroom instruction appears. How do you know you have a great item in alignment to the standards, which provides students with a way to demonstrate their understanding in a rich, meaningful, and authentic way? How you scaffold this process in order to make the text more accessible could be accomplished through making the tasks more complex. So in other words, what does rigor mean in this context? Rigor is used in relation to text complexity. For example, in describing the reading standards for literature, rigor is also infused through the requirement that students read increasingly complex texts through the grades. Rigor refers to the goal of helping students to continue developing their capacities as readers, so that each passing year they build upon the skills and understandings developed during the previous year. Teachers who immerse their students in rich textual environments require increasing amounts of reading and help students choose ever more challenging texts, which addresses rigor as defined by the Common Core. This means keeping students at the center, motivating them to continually develop as writers and readers, and engaging them in literacy projects that are relevant to their lives. According to Sarah Brown Westling's How to Teach Text Complexity trainings, text complexity is where you deconstruct text, have it match the task, and have the text and the task match the student's ability. Text complexity is relevant to all readers and all teachers. Text complexity is never determined by a single characteristic. Teachers must make purposeful matches between text, task, and reader. The more difficult the task, the more difficult the concept, the more accessible the text. So here, linking research with practice, a local assessment toolkit and guide to school leaders, is Karen Hess's 2013 Tools for Examining Text Complexity. We can use these supports in order to look at how complex the text is and whether or not it's appropriate for our instruction. Quantitative measures. Quantitative measures uses word frequency and sentence length to produce a single measure called the lexile of text complexity. In addition, it is not possible to produce an accurate readability estimate for some types of passages. Because no readability formula is perfect, qualitative measures and teacher content review committees should provide expert opinions on grade level appropriateness for passage used in assessments. Some reading programs then use these scores to assign text to students. The Lexile framework, like traditional formulas, may underestimate the difficulty of texts that use simple, familiar language to convey sophisticated ideas, as is true of much high-quality fiction written for adults and appropriate for older students. For this reason and others, it is possible that factors other than word familiarity and sentence length contribute to text difficulty. Measures of text complexity must be aligned with the college and career readiness expectations for all students. Each of these quantitative tools described here have their limitations and are not completely accurate. Certain measures are less valid or inappropriate for certain kinds of text. Many current quantitative measures underestimate the challenge posed by complex narrative fiction. Lexile scores of 1080 to 1355 should occur in high school and beyond. Historically, what has text complexity looked like for Montana's CRT assessment, the NAEP assessment, and what will it look like for the Smarter Balance assessment used to measure the Montana Common Core state standards? Here we can see the Lexile measures given for each of the assessments, the word counts that are actually given for those assessments, and since the Smarter Balance assessment's pilot was given in 2014 and the 2015 full implementation does not occur till this spring, we do not have an actual word count to insert here. We also can see the targeted word counts for each of these. The new Lexile meets the levels of complexity needed to meet the Common Core state standards and Smarter Balance guidelines for college and career readiness. Regardless of the readability estimate used, passage writers or finders should select texts that cover a range of difficulty. Item writers must use good judgment in selecting stimulus that is challenging and complex but still appropriate. This allows the task to cultivate the student's ability to read complex text independently, as well as scaffolds can experience complex text rather than avoid the complexity of the text. When productive struggle with the text is exhausted, questions rather than explanations can help focus the student's attention on key phrases and statements in text or on the organization of ideas in the paragraph. Here's an example of a quantitative measure that shows Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises as a low Lexile. But is this text appropriate for students who can only understand the words, not understand the style, language, context, and content in this text? This would be a great example of why teacher judgment is necessary in order to match the reader with the text and the task. Here's more about the words and language features found in the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts. Tier 1 words rarely require instructional attention in school. These are the familiar words. Tier 2 words have high utility determined by use and context, and are considered high-frequency use for mature language users. They are found across a variety of domains and texts, and according to the age, we tend to assume that some students know, but have often only heard of the word. Tier 3 words are low-frequency words. These are often limited to content-specific domains, important to learn when the specific need arises, critical for content area learning. Here are the qualitative measures for text complexity. The qualitative and quantitative measures of text complexity described below are representative of the best tools presently available. However, each should be considered only provisional. More precise, more accurate, and easier to use tools are urgently needed to help make text complexity a vital everyday part of classroom instruction and curriculum planning. Using qualitative measures of text complexity involves making an informed decision about the difficulty of text in terms of one or more factors discernible for a human reader, applying judgment to the task. Here is the meaning and purpose. The purpose for informational texts and levels for literary texts. Levels of meaning. Literary texts with a single level of meaning tend to be easier to read than literary texts with multiple levels of meaning. Similarly, informational texts with an explicitly stated purpose are generally easier to comprehend than informational texts with an implicit, hidden, or obscure purpose. The structure. The structure of texts of low complexity tend to have simple, well-marked, and conventional structures, whereas high complexity tend to have complex, implicit, and particularly in literary texts, unconventional structures. Graphics tend to be simple and either unnecessary or merely supplementary to the meaning of the text with low complexity, whereas texts with high complexity tend to have similarly complex graphics, whose interpretation is essential to the understanding of the text. For language conventionality and clarity, texts that rely on literal, clear, contemporary, and conversational language tend to be easier to read than texts that rely on figurative, ironic, ambiguous, purposely misleading, archaic, or otherwise unfamiliar language, or on general academic and domain-specific vocabulary. And lastly, the knowledge demands. Texts that make few assumptions about the extent of the reader's life experience and the depth of their cultural, literary, and content discipline knowledge are generally less complex than are texts that make assumptions in one or more of these areas. The reader, task, and text must be a good match. It is crucial that teachers make sure the task is a good match for the student. You should know your students and their background knowledge. You can provide them with more multifaceted tasks, but you need to make sure that the reader and the tasks have a good marriage. That is, we must know our purpose and what we want our students to learn. With a clear understanding of the purpose, we are more able to connect the reader and the task in a more purposeful way. Again, back to the statement, the more difficult the task, the more difficult the concept, the more accessible the text. All of these aspects influence our text choice.